Welcome to Episcopals, the public witness podcast where we bring awareness to pressing public policy issues, civic engagement, and help bring your faith into the public square. I'm your host, Yarborough, Director of Government Relations and Global Partnerships for the Episcopal Church. So we're here with Susie, Faria, our policy advisor for the environment, and a number of other issues. Here to talk about a simple topic today, Susie, nuclear disarmament. So beyond sort of the threat of doom, I'm curious what motivates you to advocate on this topic.
The nuclear arms conversation is very fascinating as a person born after the Cold War ended. It's a different world we live in a lot of ways. It's not quite it doesn't feel as much like an active threat as it did in the 20th century, right. But it's still very much there. It is kind of this underground ultimate threat of not only are there still all of the weapons that existed in 1989, but a lot of other countries are now also building out their nuclear arsenals or attempting to develop their own nuclear weapons. And so in many ways, rather than it being just a couple of players in the game, there are now a few more. And we still have all of those weapons and are either updating them or are continuing to invest in them in one way or another to make them more advanced. And I don't think it's all that strange to say that this could be detrimental. We're talking apocalyptic at times. That was always kind of the rhetoric around it. These are incredibly powerful weapons. In terms of personal relationship to it, fairly limited in my experience. My family-wise, my grandmother was pregnant with my mother during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I can imagine was a very stressful time to be pregnant and expecting your third child. But more recently, I had a really wonderful experience attending a vigil, because it is the 80th anniversary year of when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there was a commemorative vigil with some of our faith partners that I got to attend recently. And I got to hear from the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church had a bishop who very quickly after the bombs were dropped, he sent school supplies, he sent art supplies to the children who were the survivors of the bombings. And they ended up coloring pictures and sending them back. And so they have these really beautiful pieces of art from the kids who survived these horrible bombings. And they said that when they received those colored drawings from these kids, they got a note from them saying, "Thank you for giving us color again," because those bombs had erased all of the color. In addition to killing hundreds of thousands of people, they also took away all color from their world. And that's just such a stark and kind of vivid image to hear from children. And I don't think we should ever allow that to happen again. And so that's kind of made it maybe not personal to me, but certainly given me language in which to relate to this issue in a different way than I had previously.
Yeah, that's really a compelling story, and also appreciate you're talking about the experience of going to a vigil for something so heavy and the impact that an event or a service like that can have. It's really, really powerful. So recognizing, hear you in some ways it feels like old history, but, nuclear arms are still around today. I'm wondering if you could give a brief overview on sort of the state of affairs with nuclear arms now.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, there's more actors involved globally surrounding different countries who are expanding their nuclear arsenals. And I don't think it should be a controversial thing to say that more nuclear weapons are bad for everybody, especially when we are still living in a world where the survivors of the only two true bombings are still around, right? Like 80 years is a long time. It's still a lifetime. And so there are still a lot of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki who have spent their entire lives now advocating for nuclear disarmament. In the US context, the United States is still spending billions of dollars to both update, modernize, and expand their nuclear arsenal. This is scary for a number of reasons. One, because accidents can happen. It also kind of perpetuates the reliance on certain communities that they have on these weapons for economic purposes, even though they are kind of incredibly harmful. And it's just kind of an extension of the Cold War, right? We're not, yes, the Soviet Union no longer exists, the Cold War has ended, but there is still kind of this underlying thing of, yes, there are still quite a few countries that if the circumstances are right, they would be willing to bomb another country, which should never happen again. And so I think the issue of escalation is still incredibly major. There's also just a lot of social justice issues. I think, it can sound very high level, right? When you're talking about entire countries and what their governments might do in an international context. But there's a lot of individuals who are involved with this. And yes, there's the survivors of the bombings in Japan, but there's also the survivors of the testing sites. Yeah. Those are victims in a different way. There's displaced peoples in Pacific Islands who, when they've returned, they have these toxic waters and lands left behind because they were forced to leave their homes for nuclear testing. There's a lot of high rates of disease that comes from being in and around either the testing, the development, or the aftermath of an actual bomb used. So increased rates of cancer, thyroid disease, cardiovascular diseases, and radiation syndromes are all very common and exist in much higher levels for people who have experienced these things. And then, of course, there's the environmental degradation of areas that have either been bombed or used for testing sites. This is not just a human issue. It affects other species as well, quite devastatingly as well. And, if you can destroy a building, you think a forest is going to be able to stand up to it as well. So it touches on many more aspects of society rather than just kind of the international politics of a handful of global leaders.
Right. Yeah. No, that's helpful context. What has the church said on this topic?
Yeah. So I think our first and most prominent General Convention resolution comes from 1997. And so it's supporting the goal of total nuclear disarmament is the title of it. And so that's been our main guiding work. Support the goal of total nuclear disarmament. So that's global. In terms of what we do as an office, we've signed on to a lot of letters. This is a very common thing for us to do, of adding the Episcopal Church to a list of signatories on a letter asking the government to do something. In this case, we often ask Congress specifically, as this is well within their power. We are also in support of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which that was adopted in 2017. Our colleague Linnea works on the UN level of these types of things. We call for, which the prohibition from the UN calls for the prohibition of development, testing, use, and transfer of nuclear weapons under international law. So that's a pretty broad and kind of multilateral, as the term is, way of looking at it. Big term, but how global actors interact essentially. And the UN refers to nuclear war and climate change kind of within the same breath, and they call them twin existential threats. And so, which is a very fair thing. I think those are two very existential threats to humanity, but also to the world that we live in, both as people, but also, again, other species as well. And so I think more specifically in terms of congressional action on the U.S. front, we have been in supporting a resolution in Congress. So there's a bicameral introduction. So there's one in the House and one in the Senate that kind of calls for the U.S. president to lead the nuclear disarmament globally.
Yeah. And I know our regular listeners are familiar with our action alerts, these chances to write their members of Congress, at times other elected officials, directly about issues of importance to the church and to people, communities across the country. So do we have an action alert on this?
We absolutely do. Support Global Nuclear Disarmament is the name of the alert. And again, this is in support of those two resolutions in Congress, again, asking for additional co-sponsorship and support of them so that hopefully they pass. Very similarly to all of our other alerts, if your congressperson has already signed on, you get to send them a thank you. And if they haven't, you get to send them a note encouraging them to do so. So I strongly encourage anybody who either hasn't taken action on that yet or would like to take action again, because again, as long as it's live, you can keep sending messages to do so. This resolution highlights a couple of very specific things, because in addition to asking the US president to call for the US to start diffusing and dismantling their own nuclear arms system, it also has a lot of justice aspects to it. So we're talking about economic justice for communities that are reliant on these testing sites or these sheltering sites or whatever context that they need to be in proximity to these weapons. We're asking for economic justice so that they still have a community and are able to find other types of jobs in a different realm. But it also calls for additional outreach and treatment for victims of nuclear testing and things like that, those who have become sick because of the harms that these weapons can cause. So there's more to it than just asking the US to be a leader in this way, which is already a big ask, right. But it's not forgetting about the individual people who have been impacted by these weapons.
Yeah. Well, thanks for elaborating on the complexity of this. Something that I think I agree with you or resonates with me, that in some ways we simplify the topic as, there are two world powers and it's only a sort of that high level geopolitical conversation, but there's a lot more depth to it. We don't do this work alone. We work with other organizations. Episcopalians can connect to others as well. They're outside of the church, sometimes inside the church as well, and church-affiliated organizations. So who else is out there where Episcopalians can connect?
Yeah, I think one of our strongest partners that has really been incredible leaders in this space is an organization called Back from the Brink. We have signed on to many of their letters. We're co-sponsors of the vigil I talked about earlier. And this is their entire work, right? Whereas we're an office that has many topics, this is their topic. And so they do incredible work to push for nuclear disarmament globally and kind of bring us back from the brink of nuclear war is where their title comes in. We also have General Convention resolutions asking for us to directly work with that organization, as they are such wonderful leaders in this space. And also, just to mention, Episcopal Peace Fellowship also does some great work on this. They also support these resolutions and work alongside their partners in this space as well. So there are other organizations that this is a major priority from.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time talking about this and being a part of helping to empower Episcopalians to speak out and make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Stay involved through the Episcopal Public Policy Network and browse our action alerts at iam.ec/action. In our next episode, we will talk about ways you can protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.